Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining this workshop session on how sustainable sourcing programs can drive positive financial returns with our company partner, McCormick. If you don't mind and haven't already, we encourage everyone to turn their cameras on to make this a more collaborative experience. However, we do kindly ask to put yourselves on mute to avoid any background noise if possible. By way of introduction, my name is Ritu Raman. I'm currently a research associate here at CSB. I'm joined by Emma Gladstone, who is the sustainability manager at McCormick Global Ingredients Limited. You may have also just heard from Donald Pratt, who is managing director at McCormick Global Ingredients, and representatives from other companies during the Sustainable Agriculture panel just before this workshop. And, Donald and Emma were key participants and our main points of contact in our ROSI engagement, and we are very delighted to have them participate in our practice forum this year. So, from the panel event just now, we have heard at a high level from some of our food and ag company partners and how our engagements tie into our overall framework that we've been developing and will be launching later this year that Tansi had touched upon in her presentation. So for this particular workshop session, we will spend more time, diving into the application of ROSI in the context of our McCormick engagement, which was focused on the value of sustainable sourcing and how company partners, even across industries, can leverage insights from these types of collaborations going forward. So in terms of the agenda and walkthrough of this workshop, I'm going to spend the first 20 to 25 minutes or so just providing a high-level overview of our collaboration with McCormick and our insights from the project, which will also include a walkthrough of an illustrative monetization model in Excel. And this sort of kind of serves as an example of how we can bring our ROSI process to life a bit more in terms of how we monetize some of the benefits that we find from our collaborations. We will then have a conversation with Emma where we will discuss and share insights on the ROSI collaboration process and her experience throughout this work. And then also we'd like to take the last 10 or so minutes for an open discussion, including answering your questions and also just to hear your thoughts and feedback on the ROSI framework and how you can see this tool potentially working in your organization, if applicable. And lastly, just in terms of some administrative and housekeeping items, throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will try to answer them when possible. We will also, of course, spend time at the end for you to ask any questions. We kindly ask again that you put yourselves on mute, and during the Q&A session, when you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself because we definitely want to make this as engaging as possible for you. Okay, so let's dive in. So as a quick refresher from some of our previous events this morning, CSB works with company partners by implementing our ROSI framework that we developed here at the center. So ROSI again stands for the Return on Sustainability Investment. And the thesis of this framework is that when a company embeds sustainability practices or initiatives that are core to its business model or mission, it can improve the areas highlighted in the light blue here that we call ROSI mediating factors. So for example, engaging in a sustainability program could improve, risk management from like a regulatory, reputational, operational risk as an example. There's also operational efficiency, which may involve, increasing production synergies and potentially lowering costs. There's talent management, like thinking about employee well-being. And another example could be customer loyalty, which is about, attracting and bringing in and retaining customers and other types of partners. And so we believe that an improvement in any of these mediating factors can potentially lead to what we call positive financial outcomes or ROSI benefits, such as revenue growth, increased profitability, and overall higher company valuation and potentially a lower cost of capital that can overall create a positive societal impact and business value as a whole. So as Tansi kind of highlighted in her presentation, using the ROSI framework, we are currently developing a food and agriculture framework in which we have identified and assessed sustainability initiatives being implemented across the value chain with the help of research and our previous and current engagements with a number of food and ag related companies. So from our work so far, as you see here on the slide, we have identified about 12 strategies that companies can implement. So examples would include improving soil health, improving water security, ensuring protection of biodiversity, et cetera. And so from these 12 strategies, the focus for this workshop today with McCormick is, of course, to delve into sustainable sourcing and the benefits that can come from this type of initiative. But if you want to learn more about our framework as a whole and our development as we continue throughout this year, we definitely encourage you to check back on our website to see our progress and insights that we have gathered, at any point in time. Okay, so now that we provided a bit of background on ROSI and our food and ag framework, I think we can spend a few minutes, diving into McCormick's Sustainable Sourcing Program, or SSP for short, which was established a few years ago. So as Donald was mentioning in the panel earlier, as part of SSP, McCormick is aiming to source all its herbs and spices in its portfolio sustainably by starting with 100% of its top 5 iconic products, which are black pepper, cinnamon, oregano, red pepper, and vanilla by 2025. And this program sits within the company's larger mandate called the Purpose-Led Performance Guiding Principles, which involves implementation of, a number of sustainability-oriented goals and initiatives, such as, reduction in packaging waste, reduction in GHG emissions, et cetera. But to give some insight or examples of how McCormick is defining its sourcing program, below on the slide here, we have about 6 of the many attributes within the program. So, as Donald was mentioning, the company offers hands-on farmer education and training at its sourcing sites, which allows the development of a strong relationship between McCormick and the farmer community. And from that, the more direct farmer engagement also allows for shorter supply chains, which increases, farmer premiums for a better life and overall improved well-being. McCormick also provides or facilitates in providing community resources, such as offering healthcare, schooling and education, and also infrastructure development at these sourcing sites. And lastly, for the last 2 attributes, there are also donor-funded programs as well as implementation of certifications. McCormick has its own standard, Grown for Good, as was mentioned, but there's also third-party certifications such as the Rainforest Alliance, which sets rigorous standards on sustainable sourcing practices as well. Okay, so now that we have a bit of a background on SSP, I think we can dive into the focus of our ROSI collaboration and engagement. So both CSB and McCormick were mutually interested in assessing and monetizing the company's sourcing program to better understand, the benefits from these initiatives and their monetary value. So through our collaboration process, we researched and interviewed various stakeholders, both internal and external to McCormick, I think about 30 or so stakeholders, and found that there were a variety of benefits to consider from this program. So using ROSI, we selected 4 benefits that we would explore and monetize, which are the ones listed here. So we have incremental profit from increased sales and marketing of SSP, reduced cost of debt due to perceived risk reduction from the program, cost avoidance due to effective risk management, and also increased value of earned media or public press from brand exposure. And we found that SSP is creating these benefits for McCormick, which can potentially, accelerate or increase in financial impact with ongoing investments into the program. And so after going ahead and monetizing each of these benefits and working with key stakeholders to really be able to ground it in reality, we found that the benefits are estimated to be about $6 million in 2019 and have the potential to increase by 60 to 70% in 2025. And one thing that's important to highlight from these results is both CSB and McCormick were conservative with these estimates with the intent to refine the data and the monetization process over time, which is what ROSI is sort of made to do. It's supposed to be an iterative process that improves over a certain time period. And so given this, it's pretty clear that there's potential for increased financial upside in the future. Okay. So now for the next few slides in this presentation, I think we'll go into detail on each of the 4 benefits just to highlight, how we approach the monetization process. So for sales and marketing specifically, we explored what the sales impact or lift could be if McCormick included a logo or messaging on product labels for the iconic spices and herbs, which communicate the company's sustainable sourcing efforts to consumers. So these communication strategies could be, including sustainable sourcing information, adding relevant certifications on product packaging for each of these ingredients. And so to determine the sales impact, we had to leverage reasonable proxies for market performance. So in this instance, we looked at organic product labeling, given its similar attributes to some degree to sustainable sourcing. And so to calculate this benefit, we looked at two scenarios and took the delta to determine the monetary value. So for the alternative scenario, we determined the profit generated from putting on-pack labeling regarding SSP starting in 2022. For the base case scenario, we determined the profit generated from doing the status quo from the company's current sales strategy. And so the delta between the two scenarios is the value of the benefit, which we have here as 1.5 million in 2025. And during our Excel walkthrough, which we'll go over after this presentation, we will explore an illustrative monetization example of this benefit, where we'll go into a bit more detail on the types of data and assumptions we use in these types of benefits for all of our collaborations. Okay, so for our second benefit, we explored how the sustainable sourcing program may potentially lower McCormick's cost of capital due to growing investor interest about sustainability and sustainability risk. So given the existence of the company's program, the sourcing program specifically, and its ability to potentially reduce risk, we found that the company could reduce its cost of debt by about 10 basis points or 0.1%, which has the potential to save the company up to around 1 million in 2025. And so for this benefit, we collaborated pretty closely with McCormick's treasury team during this process and feel that this could be a possible scenario given the increase in ESG interest from investors. And so in terms of the actual calculation, we looked at the company's planned annual debt issuances for the next few years and multiplied it by the reduction in the cost of debt, which is the 10 basis points. And so this annual benefit will continue as long as the debt is outstanding, since now the company could potentially, have lower debt payments than they could previously. Okay, so moving on to the third benefit. So we explored how SSP can reduce the company's exposure to different types of risks, such as product quality, supply risk due to negative events like weather or climate change, and unethical practices within the supply chain. And we found that the reduction in risk outweighed the cost of investing in this program, resulting in a cost avoidance opportunity of about $5.4 million in 2025. And so to calculate this benefit, we looked at two scenarios, one without SSP and one with SSP, to find the delta. So for the alternative scenario, which was without SSP, we looked at the average cost of each of these three risk events times the annual probability of the negative impact of the event occurring without the sourcing program. And so moving to the base case scenario, we looked at the exact same variables, but looking at it with SSP and how the risk would be affected by implementing this type of program. And we roughly found that the magnitude of the event occurring, like the cost that be involved, may be the same between the two scenarios and may not change by much. However, the probability of the risk of a negative financial impact occurring could potentially be lower because of the resiliency built in from this SSP program. So, therefore, with this benefit, McCormick has the ability to reflect on the avoided costs that this program is generating so that it can be better informed of additional risk drivers that could come up in the future. Okay, so for the fourth and final benefit, we explored how SSP affects McCormick's public and media exposure from a brand marketing perspective. So in other words, how much awareness is the company generating on its sourcing program in terms of articles, interviews, et cetera. And so we found that McCormick already has actually a great baseline of media coverage that has the potential to grow and expand as it continues to market its sustainability program. So in terms of how we valued this benefit, we looked at how many earned media impressions McCormick received annually. So this is basically impressions the company is receiving on free or organic media that is publicly available, times the dollar value per media impression from external publications and academic research. So based on these two variables, McCormick could achieve up to about $1.9 million in benefits from the value of its earned or free media coverage in 2025. So what does that 1.9 million actually mean, right? So one way that this can be used is it can be used as an internal benchmarking tool to gauge the company's media performance over time. Because having increased media improvements could also help entice potentially new customers and partnerships with other organizations as well. And another way also is to think about the company's overall media marketing spend. So potentially the company can think about how to reallocate a portion of this $1.9 million, since they are getting a lot of this media attention organically and free through the public exposure of the program. Okay, so now that I've talked about the 4 benefits, I'm now going to walk through our Excel model, actually. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. Okay. And is that viewable?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I know this might be a little bit hard to read, so I'm just going to talk about the format at a high level, and then I'll zoom in and go into some of the line items. So for this example, we're looking at sales and marketing. So again, we were looking at 2 scenarios here. We're just looking at the base case versus alternative scenario in terms of putting a sustainable sourcing messaging or logo on pack, and what is the incremental profit specifically that McCormick can accrue from doing this. So just in terms of the layout, we have the base case scenario here, which is the status quo. The main line item here is total profit, and I'll go through the line items in a moment. And then we have here the alternative scenario, which is looking at sustainable sourcing label on pack. And again, we have the total profit, which is the key line item in this scenario as well. And then of course you have the final results, which is taking the delta and just subtracting between the 2 scenarios to see what the benefit creation is, or the incremental profit that McCormick can achieve. Okay, great. And then again, just to illustrate, this is all the data here is illustrative. It's all sort of dummy data. And we've also very much simplified it as well, just to get a sense of how we would go about doing this type of monetization. Okay, great. So let me just zoom in for a second. So, okay, so just taking this line by line for a second. So when we did the sales and marketing model, we actually did it for all 5 iconics, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to just be using vanilla as an example here. And again, all the data is sort of fictionalized. So the first thing I do for the base case scenario is we took what is the total market sales for vanilla. This is extending beyond McCormick. What are the global sales, or how big is the vanilla market? So for our work with McCormick, we used or leveraged IRI data. And so we leveraged information directly from that database. So IRI contains point of sales consumer purchasing data. If a company doesn't have access to IRI, there's potentially looking at Nielsen data. And then of course, we would look at external databases or academic research to be able to inform our decisions if that data isn't available. So essentially for historical time periods, which we had from 2018 to 2020, we kind of have the market information, and then we grew it out based on a projection assumption to 2025. So for simplicity purposes, I'm just using the compounded annual growth rate, so CAGR, based on the past years, but of course there are other ways to grow out future projections in the coming years. So after we had that, we then looked at McCormick's market share. So here I have a stagnant 40%. Realistically, this will probably change up and down based on the company's actual market share. But for now, we kind of kept it simple and said, okay, we're going to pretend that McCormick's market share is 40% for vanilla specifically. And then for the next line item, we have McCormick sales. So this is just a calculation. So we just multiply the total market sales for vanilla times the McCormick market share to get McCormick sales. And so we did that across the board up until 2025. And then the last main variable we have here is looking at profit margin. So we looked at profit margin because we're specifically looking at incremental profit. That's the main metric we're looking at for this benefit. But of course, in previous collaborations, you looked at contribution margin. If you're only looking at variable costs, there's other types of metrics that also can be used as well, just depending on what the client wants in a conversation and what they use for their internal analysis. So we have here 30% as just a placeholder, and of course you would just multiply that by the sales amount to get what the total profit is. So that's at a high level kind of how we would approach a base case scenario. Nothing really has changed. We're assuming that the current trends are going to continue in the coming years. So for the alternative scenario now, the line items are exactly the same, but naturally they're going to differ a little bit. So for the total market sales for vanilla line item, the inputs are exactly the same. We're growing it out at the same CAGR rate because we don't know otherwise in terms of the market growth. In terms of McCormick market share, this is where things are going to get a little bit different. So in this scenario, we're assuming that McCormick starts labeling their sustainably sourced products starting in 2022. So from 2018 to 2021, we're going to keep it the same market share as it was in the base case scenario. But then now for 2022 and beyond, we're going to start seeing an uptick. So for this example, I just put like a percentage point increase compared to the base case, and it continues on and then stagnates at about 43% up until 2025. So when we did this, when we tried to find these assumptions in our actual model with McCormick, again, we looked at how McCormick's organic product labeling was performing, what was the market share growth compared to its conventional products, and tried to use that growth as a proxy for the market share performance for sustainable sourcing. And the reason I did that is because we thought the organic product labeling was a reasonable proxy to assume how the sustainable sourcing products would perform as well, and given the information that we had at the time. And then after we did that, the math stays the same. So we have McCormick sales, which is just multiplying again the market sales times the market share. And then we kept the profit margin the same. So this could change. Technically, the profit margin could go up and down depending on what the cost would be associated with having product labeling now on pack. But again, for simplicity purposes, we've kept the profit margin the same here. And then, of course, you get your total profit, which is going to be the same as the base case up until 2021. And then, of course, you're going to see an uptick in 2022 and beyond. So, okay, so those are the two scenarios that we did. So what are the final results? So naturally, for the incremental profit or the benefit value that we're calling here, it's going to be zero from 2018 to 2021 because there is no difference in terms of marketing on pack up until that time. And then starting in 2022, you're going to see the delta difference of about, in this example, it's 5.8 million up until 20.9 million, of course, driven by the increase in market share growth. And then the last thing to mention, because that's our absolute benefit number, but sometimes in our models, we include a discount factor depending on the data that we're including in the model. So it's basically a sensitivity tool to ground our results in reality. So for example, if we feel like if I used a product sales data set that's beyond the 5 iconics, for example, then we may want to whittle it down or scale it down to more reasonable results in magnitude by using this percentage tool. So it would just be multiplying the absolute benefit by this amount to get a more grounded or realistic number for our benefits. Here, I just put 100%, again, to keep it simple, so the result's the same, but it would obviously differ and be lower than 100% if we feel like the data can be improved upon and refined in the future. So that's just at a high level how we would approach an Excel monetization example. Again, this is a very simplistic sort of walkthrough, but the idea for ROSI in general is to build a foundational analysis that can be iterated and improved over time. Because I think with ROSI, how it works best is taking data from different points across the company to tell a story and to be able to monetize a particular sustainability metric, with the hope that we then transition the model over to McCormick or other company partners, and then be able to refine this over time, whether it means having different data collection processes and really being able to sit with key subject matter experts to make this the best tool possible to track sustainability performance over a certain time period. So, okay, great. So now that we have talked about the monetization tool, I think we can now transition it over to our conversation with Emma. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Emma, I'm just going to spotlight you for a moment.
Sure.
Okay, great. So Emma, before we dive into some of the questions that we have, would you mind just sharing a bit about your background and your responsibilities and role within McCormick?
Sure, of course. And thank you very much for having me, Rithi. So I've been working for McCormick for around about 7 or 8 years now, working in our herbs and spices supply chains. Over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I transitioned into the sustainability team. And currently I lead our programs for the sustainable sourcing of oregano, red pepper, and cinnamon. I also work on our community resiliency programs and our programs relating to gender equality and empowering women within our supply chains.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. So I guess just to take a step back before we get into ROSI specifically and the collaboration. I know Donald had touched upon this during the panel event, but what is the long-term objective for McCormick's sustainable sourcing program, and how do you think it can help the company sort of differentiate itself from its peers or competitors?
So as you mentioned before, obviously our long-term goal is to source all our herbs and spices sustainably, starting with 100% of the top 5 branded iconic raw materials. That's the goal for 2025. In order to define what that means for McCormick, we created what we call a Grown for Good framework, which outlines our sustainable sourcing strategy under the 3 pillars of ethical supply chains, regenerative agriculture, and resilient communities. We've also, Donald mentioned, in the last panel, we've created our own Grown for Good agricultural standard, and that's now being rolled out to multiple supply chains. So we're making significant progress towards our 2025 targets. And in our last purpose-led performance report, we actually announced the expansion of our sustainable sourcing program, which is now going to include an additional 7 ingredient categories. And also this year, we are starting to commercialize the sustainable volumes as well in North America and EMEA. So within the investment community, I believe there is an awareness of McCormick's sustainability credentials. We've received a number of accolades. We were one of the inaugural recipients of the Terracotta Seal, which recognizes private sector companies that are leading their peers in creating genuinely sustainable markets. We were named as a United Nations Global Compact Lead Company in 2021. We've been ranked 14th overall on the Corporate Knights 100 Most Sustainable Companies, and we've also been recognized on Diversity Inc.'s top 50 list of companies for diversity. In terms of, looking at B2B, with our Grown for Good standard, that's been benchmarked at silver level against the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative's FSA program, which really, can comprehensively demonstrate that our sustainability achievements, align with those of our customers, particularly, in the flavor solutions business. I think one of our biggest challenges really remains, communicating with consumers. However, I do believe that as McCormick builds consumer knowledge around our programs, the way we can differentiate ourselves is through the scale and impact of our projects, obviously coupled with, our legacy advantages of superior flavor and purity.
Amazing. Yeah, and that's actually a good interesting point about the consumer attractiveness and being able to communicate it directly to end consumers specifically. And so that kind of leads me to my next sort of thought is, I guess going off that, why were you interested in implementing ROSI for the sourcing program? And I guess what were your hopes or outcomes to come out of this type of collaboration?
So I think, within our team, we're sustainability professionals. And so we were aware of the inherent benefits of investing in sustainability projects, but we didn't really have the tools or data to back up these theories. We wanted to build the business case for sustainable sourcing. We wanted to further demonstrate the benefits we were already accruing, but also highlight some potential future benefits for the company as well. I think that, our challenge was to get buy-in from middle tier management for our programs, those people whose support we needed to unlock even more value for the company from, our sustainable sourcing projects. So when it came to the ROSI methodology, it kind of seemed to be that missing link that could demonstrate how our sustainable sourcing strategies link to our financial performance. So, we felt we could leverage the value of the ROSI exercise kind of as a baseline with the possibility to review every couple of years and understand how the company is evolving in the efficacy of delivering value from sustainability initiatives. Obviously the Center of Sustainable Business had already completed a couple of these analyses on agricultural supply chains, and therefore we felt, you had the expertise and experience to really fulfill this need. And obviously, having a highly credible third party like NYU Stern conducting it, really provided sort of the credibility behind the work as well.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very nice of you. But we are finding that a lot of times in doing these collaborations, such as with McCormick, that a lot of it's getting the buy-in, right? Or developing a type of monetization framework for senior management to say, okay, here's a systematic way of being able to quantify the values that we do have now the priorities in terms of putting additional funding into the program to help expand it, right? So we are finding that providing the business case from a monetary perspective can be helpful to sort of continue to grow and meeting sustainability goals. So that's very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I guess just to dive in a bit more, I guess specifically on the details on that. So since obviously you were very close to our ROSI data analysis, so just curious about what you learned from the process and what you thought was most useful in terms of takeaways, and if at all, if there's some results from the collaboration that you're building into McCormick's internal processes.
Sure. So, I think from more of a personal perspective, I sat in on nearly all of the interviews between the CSB team and our internal stakeholders here at McCormick. And they really provided me with a really comprehensive insight into how, the different business functions within McCormick viewed sustainability. And those were insights, I probably wouldn't have gained just through, regular business operations. And I also really believe that was a two-way process. So after these discussions, I think many of the participants were more aware of how sustainability programs impact them. And they began to consider, what data might be available or should be collected, or, just in general, better understood the impact on their function. More from a business perspective, I think having the ability to monetize intangible benefits, was incredibly useful. We as an organization really value data. So having the ability to summarize sort of in one page the existing value and potential future value of our sustainable sourcing programs, really enabled us to sort of target that internal messaging. In terms of, what we would do differently as a result of the analysis, I think over the last 12 months or so, there's been a shift within the organization. And there's the desire to incorporate, all of our purpose-led performance strategy into everything we do a little bit more. Understanding the monetary benefits from our sustainable sourcing work can only help to, accelerate this. In actual fact, our chairman, president, and CEO, Lawrence Kurzius, he actually outlined our intention to incorporate sustainability into our consumer marketing strategy at the CAGNY conference this year. So basically, our intentions are to integrate purpose into consumer communications, provide transparency through connected packaging, continue with our global rollout of recyclable packaging, and finally, and obviously most exciting for us in the sustainable sourcing team, is the intention to incorporate our Grown for Good logo on packaging.
Ooh, that's so exciting. I'm excited to see all of that come about. So that's really great to hear.
Yeah.
And then I guess just my last question to wrap up this portion is, how would you, given that you're doing amazing work in this field in terms of pushing sustainability in general forward and all the types of initiatives you're doing within the PLP program, and also just being through or having gone through the ROSI process with CSB, how would you encourage food and ag related companies, or even just companies across other industries, to transition to more sustainable practices? I guess what would be the advice or just thoughts or words that you would say to them?
So I think a robust sustainability strategy is really table stakes for any company at this point, particularly in food and agriculture, where there's an increasing focus on both environmental impacts of farming, but also the social factors that are associated with sourcing, particularly from developing countries. There's definitely been a shift by organizations from focusing sort of purely on CSR, which was really just considered kind of an expense for the company, to really creating shared value through a more robust sustainability strategy. And I think really the research speaks for itself as to why it makes business sense to invest in more sustainable practices. Our ROSI analysis demonstrated a return on investment, and we use some very conservative adjustment factors in there. We spoke before, consumers, they have an increasing desire to adopt a sustainable lifestyle, and that includes choosing brands that meet their environmental and social values. And again, from an investment point of view, I think, according to Gartner, 85% of investors consider ESG factors in their investments. And again, B2B, a lot of our customers have their own strategies and they expect their suppliers to align with that. You can just take a look at projects like Walmart's Project Gigaton, for example, is just one of those. So I don't think it's necessarily that businesses should just be looking at the potential benefits. And obviously there are a lot of potential benefits there. But I also think that they should really be looking at the long-term consequences if they don't actually move over to a sustainable strategy.
Yeah, it's a really good point, especially when it comes to, getting consumers and getting a more of a consumer base, as well as just resiliency too, right? Just from an operational perspective and being able to withstand different circumstances. That's very helpful. Thanks, Emma.